Hi, besties. Before we get into this, I need you to listen closely because this story is not what it looks like on the surface. One sentence, one slip, one timeline changes everything. What started as a simple question about money slowly exposes a pattern of trust, silence, and shifting narratives. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stay with me because every detail connects and the ending changes how you understand the entire situation. Hi, besties. Welcome back because today we're stepping into the moment where everything finally stops making sense on purpose. And when that happens, you know someone is hiding something. And this story starts with a simple question that refuses to go away. What money was Mary actually asking for? And why does every explanation feel designed to confuse instead of clarify? Because Mary was not asking for random money. She was not inventing a claim. She was talking about the Las Vegas house, the house she lived in, the house she paid for, the house that carried her name and her responsibility, while someone else carried the benefit. And when Cody says she wanted all the money, he leaves out the part that matters, the context, because context changes everything. And without it, the audience is meant to assume greed instead of fairness and confusion instead of clarity. And that is intentional, because when you zoom out, you realize Mary did not wake up one day and decide to fight. She trusted, she waited, she believed the system would eventually do the right thing. And that trust is what allowed this situation to grow unchecked for years. Because when the divorce happened, the decree did not split assets. It said there were none. And that single line became the foundation for everything that followed. Because there were no guardrails, no forced accountability, no clean break. And Cody remained on the title, remained on the mortgage, remained legally attached while contributing nothing financially. And that is not an opinion. That is how paperwork works. And Mary lived there, paid the bills, maintained the property, and kept going because she believed in family and faith and reconciliation. And while she did that, equity quietly accumulated. And equity is power. And whoever controls, it controls the narrative. And when the Las Vegas home sold, that equity became liquid and mobile and ready to be used somewhere else. And that somewhere else just happened to be a new life being built with Robin. And this is where the story starts looping, because suddenly family money becomes flexible. It becomes vague. It becomes something that can be claimed when needed and dismissed when questioned. And Mary's money becomes everyone's money until Mary asks about it. And then it becomes a problem. And when Robin later frames herself as someone acting to protect Mary, that framing collapses under scrutiny. Because protection does not involve delay. Protection does not involve pressure. Protection does not involve threats. And protection certainly does not involve rewriting agreed upon terms. And yet, that is exactly what happens, because Cody himself admits there was already an agreement. He admits the idea of splitting Coyote Pass evenly was his. He admits he drafted deeds. He admits he needed the money. And that admission matters because it proves the 25% was not Mary's demand. It was the compromise reached when Cody needed liquidity. And once that need was satisfied, once the house was secured, once the pressure eased, the story changed. And suddenly, fairness was questioned, and Mary's entitlement became debatable. And Robin's hesitation became righteous. And this pattern keeps repeating, because whenever Mary waits, she loses, and whenever she trusts, the rules change. And this is why the audience feels unsettled, because the explanations never line up with the outcomes, and the outcomes always benefit the same people. And when Cody says Mary wanted all the equity, he leaves out the part where he never fought her on his half, because legally his name was on it. And legality without contribution creates imbalance, and imbalance is where manipulation thrives. And Mary herself says she did not manage finances. She deferred, she trusted, she believed others were handling it responsibly. And that belief was reinforced by years of being told it was family money, until the moment it was not, until the moment that money became inconvenient, and suddenly it was personal and separate and no longer shared. And this is where the tension deepens, because if Mary's Vegas equity went directly into another home, and if that money is now being reframed as a gift instead of proceeds, then the entire structure of consent collapses, because a gift implies choice, and choice implies freedom. And there was no freedom when the system depended on that money to move forward. And silence afterward becomes suspicious, because silence is only valuable when there is something to protect. And agreements that discourage discussion are not about peace, they are about control. And Mary refusing to disappear quietly is what shifts the tone of this entire story, because once she speaks, once she clarifies, once she says every penny went into that house, the narrative can no longer pretend this was accidental or misunderstood. And that is why the language becomes emotional and defensive, because accountability feels like an attack when you are used to compliance. And this is only the beginning, because every detail we uncover pulls another thread, and every thread leads back to the same place, a system that worked as long as one person kept trusting. And the moment that trust cracked, everything else started to unravel. Now here is where the story tightens and the pressure quietly builds, because once the Vegas money is acknowledged, everything else starts to wobble, and the explanations no longer fit together the same way they once did. And that is when timing becomes the most important character in this entire situation, because timing reveals intent, and intent reveals motive. And when you line up the dates, the decisions, and the silence, you begin to see a pattern that cannot be ignored, because at the exact moment Cody needed funds to secure a new home, the conversation suddenly shifted toward selling assets and simplifying ownership, and fairness suddenly became a talking point, not because it mattered morally, but because it was convenient financially. And this is when the idea of equal splits appears on the surface, sounding reasonable, sounding balanced, sounding like closure. But beneath that surface, the groundwork had already been laid for imbalance, because ownership on paper did not reflect contribution in reality, and Mary was not on the loans for Coyote Pass, and yet she paid toward it. Mary was not living in the home purchased later, and yet her money made it possible. And this is where the concept of family money becomes a shield, because it allows responsibility to dissolve while benefit remains concentrated. And when Robin later positions herself as someone who was merely standing up for fairness, it rings hollow, because fairness does not require rewriting history, and fairness does not require withholding agreement until pressure is applied, and fairness certainly does not require suggesting that silence is the price of peace. And what keeps the audience leaning forward is the realization that these were not chaotic decisions. They were strategic pauses and carefully timed approvals, because signatures came when leverage was exhausted, and resistance came when leverage existed. And that distinction matters because it shows that power was always the driving force, not equity, not morality, not unity. And when Mary hesitated to sign documents that would erase her voice, that hesitation was framed as problematic, even though it was the first time she had asserted herself in a financial context. And that alone should tell you how unbalanced the dynamic had become, because asserting boundaries should not be treated as betrayal, and asking questions should not be treated as aggression. And yet, that is exactly how it played out. And this is why viewers feel the tension rising, because they recognize the emotional labor being demanded alongside financial sacrifice. And the most revealing part is how quickly responsibility shifts whenever scrutiny appears. Because when money is needed, it is communal, and when accountability is needed, it becomes individual. And Mary is told she benefited from family resources, while the reality is that those resources continued flowing long after her benefit ended. And when comparisons are made to other exits, other separations, other outcomes, the disparity becomes impossible to ignore, because some were allowed clean breaks with dignity, and others were asked to linger just long enough for assets to be accessed. And once that access was no longer necessary, suddenly the narrative changed. And this constant reshaping of reality is what keeps the story alive, because every explanation creates another contradiction. And every contradiction invites another question, and that is the loop that keeps viewers watching, because it is not about anger, it is about clarity, and clarity has been delayed at every turn. And the reason it matters now is because once words are spoken publicly, they cannot be pulled back. And once timelines are acknowledged, they cannot be rearranged. And once Mary says plainly where her money went, the audience fills in the gaps that were never meant to be seen. And that is why reactions become emotional, because control is slipping. And when control slips, truth has room to breathe. And this is not the end of the story. It is the midpoint where everything previously implied becomes visible, and where the quiet decisions of the past begin demanding answers in the present. And that is why this moment feels different, because it is no longer about who deserves what, but about who decided and why, and whether trust was honored or simply used. And that question lingers long after the conversation ends, pulling the audience forward, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And you start wondering what else was quietly decided, while someone else was waiting patiently, believing fairness would eventually arrive. So, here is the part that stays with you after the video ends. This was never just about money. It was about who controlled the story, who benefited from the silence, and who paid the price for trusting the system. Once the pieces line up, the pattern becomes clear, and the questions do not disappear. They get louder. Thank you for staying with me, besties. If this made you think, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, because this conversation is far from over.